Julian thought he could discard me, a used-up vessel of his wasted years, leaving me legally bound to the scraps of a prenup while he sailed off into a richer, unburdened future built on my silence and his lies. He believed my value, my very existence, was tied to the shallow narrative he'd spun. The pretty, accommodating wife who contributed little, easily set aside when her expiration date, marked clearly in his dismissive gaze, finally arrived. He didn't know that the years he saw as disposable had sharpened me into a weapon he wouldn't see coming, and that the truth I held wasn't just about reclaiming what he stole from me, but about shattering the gilded cage of his life, piece by smug, entitled Peace. This is not a story about divorce. It's about rot, reckoning, and the exquisite, bitter taste of watching a cruel man choke on his own poison. 6 years. 6 years I spent building a life with Julian, brick by painstaking brick, only to watch him decide, with a chilling lack of ceremony, that the foundation was crumbling and I was excess weight. I was 30 when he delivered the news, coolly, over cold coffee in the kitchen we'd designed together. A kitchen that now felt like the set of a play where I hadn't been given the script. "We've grown apart, Alara," he'd said, the words rehearsed, devoid of any real emotion. "It's time." Just like that. Time for what? Time for him to move on from the woman who'd been his partner, his confidant, his biggest cheerleader, for nearly a decade, starting when I was barely out of college at 21 and he was a seemingly sophisticated 25. Time for him to shed the inconvenience of a shared history, a shared home, a shared bed that had grown colder than a tomb. The real kicker, the twist of the knife, wasn't just the abruptness or the clinical detachment. It was the immediate pivot to the prenup. "Of course we'll honor the agreement," he'd added, as if this were a simple business transaction. A merger gone sour. The agreement. The document I'd signed all those years ago, young and naively in love, trusting Julian completely when he'd said it was just a formality, a way to protect the assets he had before us, a sensible step for a successful man. My own lawyer at the time, a kind but perhaps not aggressive enough woman, had explained it clearly. It protected his premarital wealth, his future earnings from his business ventures, and significantly limited spousal support. I had assets, too. A small inheritance, some savings. But compared to Julian's burgeoning empire, they were pebbles next to a mountain. I hadn't cared then. We were in love. His was mine, and mine was his, wasn't it? We were building a future. But the future Julian envisioned, it turned out, didn't include me, at least not as an equal partner. Over the years, the charming confidence I'd fallen for morphed into arrogance. My opinions were subtly, then not so subtly, dismissed. My desire to go back to school, to pursue a career I was passionate about that wasn't as financially lucrative as his, was met with patronizing smiles and comments about how it was sweet, but perhaps I should focus on supporting his demanding career instead. He didn't forbid things outright, not usually. His control was more insidious, a slow erosion of my self-worth, making me doubt my own judgment, my own capabilities. I became the woman who managed the home, hosted the right parties, and was available whenever Julian needed me, fading into the background of his increasingly bright and busy life. My contributions, the emotional labor, the domestic management, the constant support during his stressful business deals, were invisible, unvalued. When the divorce papers arrived, a few weeks after that conversation, the prenup wasn't just a formality. It was a weapon. Julian's lawyer, Thomas, was a bulldog, aggressive and utterly devoid of empathy. The initial offer, framed strictly by the prenup, was insulting. It amounted to little more than a pittance. Enough to get me started, they said, but certainly not reflecting the years of my life, my effort, my very identity that had been interwoven with Julian's. "The agreement is clear, Alara," Thomasy had stated, his voice a monotone drone over the phone. "Julian's premarital assets are protected, His business, its growth during the marriage, is primarily due to his efforts and investments. Your contributions, while appreciated domestically, do not entitle you to a significant share. Appreciated domestically. The phrase echoed in my head, a cruel mockery of the years I'd poured into making a home, supporting his life, putting his needs first. My good years, as I looked back now, felt like they had been siphoned away, invested in a man who saw me as a temporary placeholder, easily replaced when the lease was up. I felt a hot, bitter rage coil in my gut. He hadn't cheated, not that I knew of. He hadn't physically hurt me. But the emotional neglect, the casual dismissal of my worth, the cold calculation of leaving me financially vulnerable after taking the best years of my youth, felt like a deeper violation than any affair could have been. He hadn't just fallen out of love. He had used me. My lawyer, Isabella, was a revelation. Where my first lawyer had been gentle, Isabella was sharp, incisive, with eyes that missed nothing. I sat across from her in her sleek office, pouring out the years of subtle hurts, the feeling of being erased. When I finished, exhausted and tearful, she didn't offer platitudes. She leaned forward, her gaze steady. The prenup is robust, Alara, Isabella said, choosing her words carefully. It significantly limits your claims based on the standard interpretations of marital assets and spousal support in this state. Julian and Thomas know this. They are relying on it. My heart sank. So, he wins? He just gets to walk away? Isabella smiled, a slow, dangerous smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. The agreement is robust on its face, Alara. But no document exists in a vacuum. Tell me everything. Every odd phone call, every trip he was secretive about, every offhand comment about his business, his colleagues, his investments. Anything, no matter how small, that ever made you feel uneasy. Uneasy. The word was a key that unlocked a floodgate. I started talking, rambling at first, then finding a strange clarity. I spoke about the late-night calls Julian would take in his study, speaking in hushed tones. About the trips he'd take, ostensibly for business, where the details were always vague. About a specific period, about 3 years into our marriage, when he'd been particularly stressed, snapping at me, glued to his phone, talking about a big deal that would change everything. He'd made a large, sudden investment, then pulling funds from sources I didn't entirely understand. I'd asked questions gently, but he'd shut me down, telling me not to worry my pretty head about things I wouldn't understand. That line, delivered with a patronizing smile, had stung more than he ever knew. Isabella listened intently, scribbling notes, occasionally asking a pointed question. She guided me back, prompting details I'd buried, names Julian mentioned, places he traveled, even snippets of conversations I'd overheard unintentionally. She was building a puzzle, and I was the one holding the scattered, seemingly random pieces. This investment you mentioned, Isabella said, tapping her pen on her notepad. Did he ever show you paperwork, prospectuses, anything? No, I admitted. He kept all his important documents locked in his office safe. He always handled all the finances. Did he ever mention who he was doing business with on this particular deal? I thought hard. He mentioned a name once. Someone overseas? Or maybe just with foreign connections. Something like Ivanov? Or maybe Ivanovich? It was a while ago. Isabella's pen stilled. Her eyes narrowed slightly. Ivanov? Or Ivanovich? Anything else about that? Just that it was very profitable, very quickly, I recalled, and that it was complicated. He seemed nervous about it, even though he said it was a good thing. He said it would secure our future. He'd lied about that future, of course. Isabella didn't say much more about it then, but there was a new intensity in her demeanor. She asked for copies of bank statements I had access to, old tax returns, anything related to Julian's business, filings I could find. It felt invasive, like rummaging through the remains of a life I no longer recognized. But the flicker of hope Isabella had ignited pushed me forward. I wasn't just fighting for money anymore. I was fighting for validation, for the right to say that my years, my sacrifices, hadn't been worthless. I was fighting to make him see me, truly see me, not as an obstacle to be removed, but as a force he had underestimated. The divorce proceedings dragged on, a war of attrition waged by Thomas and Julian's endless resources. They pushed for quick deadlines, buried us in paperwork, and continued to insist that the prenup was absolute, that my claims were baseless. Julian's attitude in mediation was unbearable, condescending, impatient, as if I was wasting his precious time by daring to ask for anything beyond his meager offer. He looked bored. When I spoke about my feelings, his eyes glazing over. He only perked up when Thomas started talking about clauses in the prenup, his face hardening into a mask of legal entitlement. "Ilara, be reasonable," he'd said at one point, leaning back in his chair. "We both know you didn't contribute financially in a significant way. The agreement was clear. Don't make this harder than it needs to be." Harder than it needs to be? He was the one making it hard. He was the one trying to erase me, to make my history with him irrelevant, bound by a document signed by a girl who had loved him unconditionally. That bitter rage surged again, hotter this time. He wouldn't get away with it. He couldn't. Isabella, meanwhile, was quietly working behind the scenes. She hired forensic accountants, investigators. She took the scattered pieces I'd given, her, the name Ivanov, the timing of the investment, the secrecy, and started building her own puzzle. She didn't share much of her process, just told me to trust her, to keep gathering any documentation I could find, no matter how insignificant it seemed. One afternoon, Isabella called me into her office. Her expression was serious, but there was a spark in her eyes that hadn't been there before. "Ilara," she began, sitting opposite me. "Remember that name you mentioned? Ivanov?" I nodded, my heart starting to beat faster. "We've been digging," she continued, "connecting it to Julian's business transactions around that time. It's complicated, involving shell corporations and offshore accounts, but our preliminary findings are significant." She paused, letting the weight of the word hang in the air. "That big deal Julian was involved in," she said, leaning forward. "The one that made him a lot of money very quickly. It wasn't just a risky investment, Ilara. We believe it was involved in money laundering." The words hit me like a physical blow. Money laundering? Julian? My Julian? No, not my Julian anymore. Julian. The man who had shared my bed, my life, my dreams. The man who had belittled me, taken me for granted, and was now trying to strip me bare, Isabella explained in more detail. The complex transactions, the flow of money from illicit sources through seemingly legitimate businesses, some connected to individuals linked to organized crime. The name Ivanov, or variants of it, appeared in conjunction with these transactions. Julian, they suspected, wasn't just an unknowing participant. His business, his financial expertise, had been instrumental in facilitating the scheme. The rapid, unexplained wealth wasn't just smart investing. It was the profit of illegal activity. My first reaction was shock, then a cold, hard understanding. This wasn't about our marriage anymore. This was about something far darker. Something that explained the secrecy, the stress, the sudden influx of wealth, and perhaps even the way he'd changed, becoming harder, more ruthless. And it explained why he was so desperate to get rid of me, quickly and quietly, relying on the prenup as his shield. He couldn't afford for anyone to look too closely at his finances, especially not in a contentious divorce proceeding. Isabella's eyes held mine, This changes everything, Ilara. If we can prove this, or even present credible evidence, Julian's entire financial world is vulnerable. His assets could be seized. He could face criminal charges. The prenup, which relies on the assumption of legitimate assets, becomes almost secondary. Fear warred with a powerful surge of something else. Justice. Karma. The universe, perhaps, correcting an imbalance. Julian had built his empire, the one he used to diminish me, on a foundation of lies and crime. And I, the woman he deemed irrelevant, was holding the match that could burn it all down. "What do we do?" I asked, my voice surprisingly steady. "We use it," Isabella said, without hesitation. "We inform Thomas and Julian that we have evidence of financial misconduct and that we intend to pursue it aggressively, both in civil court and potentially by notifying the relevant authorities." The next meeting with Julian and Thomas was different. The smug confidence was gone from Julian's face, replaced by a pale, tight fear. Thomas, usually so arrogant, looked agitated. Isabella, by contrast, was calm, controlled, her presence radiating quiet power. Isabella didn't mince words. She laid out our findings, detailing the suspicious transactions, the links to illicit activities, the name Ivanov. She spoke factually, calmly, presenting the preliminary evidence we had gathered. She explained the potential ramifications: asset forfeiture, criminal investigation, the unraveling of Julian's carefully constructed life. Thomas sputtered, attempting to dismiss our claims as baseless accusations, a desperate attempt to circumvent the prenup. But his protest lacked conviction. Julian sat silently, his eyes fixed on Isabella, then on me. For the first time in years, I saw raw fear in them. "This isn't about the prenup anymore, Julian," Isabella said, her voice cutting through the tension. "This is about the legality of your assets. You tried to use an agreement designed for a legitimate divorce to shield yourself from the consequences of your own criminal actions. It won't work." The air in the room crackled. Thomas tried to regain control, suggesting a confidential settlement to make this go away. But the power had shifted. They weren't dictating terms anymore. We were. I spoke then, my voice clear and strong. "You spent years making me feel small, Julian. Making me believe I had no worth, that my contributions meant nothing because they weren't measured in dollars in a bank account. You took my time, my energy, my belief in us, and you tried to discard me when you were done. You wanted to punish me for not being the person you wanted me to be, for daring to want more, for simply existing in your shadow." Julian flinched. But I didn't stop. "You thought the prenup was your protection," I continued. "Your way to ensure I left with nothing while you kept everything you'd built. But you built it on a rotten foundation, Julian. And your own rot is what's bringing it down. Not me, not Isabella, but you." His face was ashen. Thomas leaned over and whispered urgently in his ear. The negotiation that followed was swift and brutal, but not for me. Julian, cornered and terrified of the potential criminal fallout, capitulated. He didn't argue about the prenup anymore. His priority was damage control, making the allegations disappear, or at least contained within a confidential settlement that would prevent them from reaching the ears of law enforcement or the press. The final settlement wasn't simply half of everything, as I might have initially wished in my anger. It was structured to give me a significant life-changing sum of money, enough to ensure my financial independence many times over, far exceeding the limitations of the prenup. More importantly, it included strict confidentiality clauses about the nature of our discoveries, a desperate attempt by Julian to bury his secrets. There were other terms too, related to the house and other assets, all tilted in my favor. As I signed the final papers, my hand didn't shake. I looked across the table at Julian, a broken, defeated man whose arrogance had finally crumbled under the weight of his own deceit. He didn't look at me. He couldn't. He had tried to reduce me to nothing, and in doing so, he had revealed the emptiness at the core of his own success. Walking out of the lawyer's office with Isabella by my side, I felt a sense of liberation that went deeper than the financial security. It wasn't just about getting what was fair, it was about justice. It was about seeing the man who had taken my years and tried to discard me face the consequences of his own actions. I hadn't sought revenge in the traditional sense, not with a calculated plan to ruin him from the start. My revenge, my karma, had been simply refusing to be a victim, daring to look closer, and allowing his own darkness to consume him. The years with Julian hadn't been wasted, not entirely. They had been a harsh education, a forging process that had burned away my naivety and tempered my spirit. I had lost time, yes, but I had gained strength, resilience, and a clarity about my own worth that no man, no prenup, could ever take away. The road ahead was uncertain, but it was mine, finally, truly mine. And that, more than any sum of money, felt like winning.